This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
As mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about this idea of, as you can see, hopefully you can see my slides behind me, of remixing digital archives. And I'll talk more in a few minutes about what I mean by that. But first, just a little bit of context. As some of you know, I think particularly those of you in the room who I've met before and talked about this, or seen at various digital humanities events, about a year ago now, or maybe even just more than a year ago, I started working with the British Library Labs on a project to work with, as Jim has mentioned, with Victorian jokes. For those of you who maybe don't know about the labs, they're a project within the British Library that aims to improve access to the British Library's digital collections and to encourage researchers and creative people to do more interesting and experimental things with some of those digital collections. And every year they run a competition where they invite people to pitch them ideas, and that's exactly what I did. Now, I'm conscious because as part of that project I ended up sort of going around a lot of universities, different libraries and digital history seminars, talking about this project. I'm sort of aware that maybe some of you have seen me talk about it before, so I thought I wanted to do something a little bit different today. But just to sort of, for those of you who haven't heard me talk about this before, a bit of a recap. So the idea I pitched to the British Library was this. What I wanted to do was to find a way to extract Victorian jokes from existing digital archives, and in particular from collections of newspapers and books, to process them, to OCR them, to tag them, and in the end to transform them into something like this, essentially a visual version of the joke, or a meme, hence the idea of the Victorian meme machine. The idea then was that this sort of visual recreation of the joke would be shared over social media, and then we would track what people did with it. And this, I should say, if you're interested in seeing what we've done already, was all done using our mechanical comedian, who you can follow if you have an appetite for terrible Victorian jokes, at Victorian Humour. Now, we worked on this for a few months, and I've been to sort of various events with the British Library talking about it, and I realised when I was preparing my talk for today that there was one question that I hadn't really answered about this project, largely because I didn't have time. But the question was probably the most important one, which was really why. Why on earth was I doing this? Why would I want to work with Victorian jokes in this way? And why on earth would we want to send them out over social media? And so that's the sort of big question I really want to talk about in this talk, my motivations for working on this project. And I think perhaps what those motivations have to say about other ways we might work with digital data in its various forms. So to return to my title slide, what I really want to talk about today is this idea of remixing digital archives. And sort of doing new things with them, bringing them into contact with each other in new ways. So just a kind of quick menu of what we're going to talk about today. First thing first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the problem is with Victorian jokes. And it's not the problem you might be thinking, which is they're not very funny. That is one of the problems, but there is another bigger problem, I think, which is perhaps stopping us from researching them and using them to our advantage. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I would term archival remixing, which in this case I use to refer to changing the way in which archives are organised, breaking down some of the boundaries and structures that currently define the way in which we use them. I'll talk a little bit then about creative remixing, and here I'm sort of thinking about how we take content from archives, give them to people, or indeed put into computer programs that, I suppose, mix them up, do new things with them, and sometimes unexpected things. And finally, and I suppose throughout all this, I'm going to be talking about this Victorian jokes project. But I want to stress before we go on that even if you have no interest at all in Victorian jokes or internet memes, I hope that kind of the ideas underpinning the project, which is all about how we do our research, how we organise our archives, I think that could apply to a whole range of different projects. So let's start with this first bit, the problem with Victorian jokes. Generally, I think the problem that we assume they have is one of reputation, namely, well, I suppose a rather bad reputation. And there's this wonderful portrait of Queen Victoria, which I absolutely love, which just captures exactly how we might imagine her, right, as the sort of the archetypal, glum, dour Victorian figure, famous, of course, for this phrase, which she may or may not have said. There's a great deal of debate on this. We are not amused. And this image of the Victorians has haunted them for a really, really long time. And for pretty much the Victorian period itself, these sort of stereotypes were in circulation. This was somehow a humourless or dour age. And you still see this today. Whenever the Victorians are mentioned, ironically, the go-to joke about them is that they don't have a sense of humour. I think most recent, I always look out for these kind of ones and make a note of them. The most recent one I saw, I think, was on the Great British Bake Off this year. If you watched that, they had a Victorian week, and one of the sort of gags that they came up with was that they had to make a not amused bouche, which again, it's just a kind of lazy go-to gag about them, right? And I've got to the point where I'm kind of sick of this, right? Because I study the Victorians, I know that they've got a great sense of humour, that they're fun, and that there is another side to them than this. And so what I've been trying to do is to challenge some of these stereotypes in my work. And instead to maybe start to see Queen Victoria like this. This is an actual photo of her smiling in a carriage. And I love this because chances are you might not have seen it before. And yet it is, Queen Victoria laughing. It seems kind of at odds with how we imagine the Victorians. One of the very first blogs I wrote years ago when I first started blogging was just a picture of Victorians smiling. And occasionally it keeps getting picked up by BuzzFeed and those kind of sites, just because people think, wow, it's weird, Victorians smiling, it seemed extraordinary. And there are whole reasons why they might have been laughing. But certainly one of them is that joking was a big part of Victorian society, or at least that's what I'm trying to prove in my research. That when you start looking for Victorian jokes, not only do they exist, but they exist in enormous numbers. I've just got a few kind of little clippings here from various joke books, newspaper joke columns, from magazines. This is just obviously the tip of the iceberg. This is not a slide of all the Victorian jokes I could find. There are millions of them. They were published in newspapers, published in books. They were told on the music hall stage, around dinner tables at the pub. There is this sort of lively culture of joking that existed throughout the 19th century, despite all of the, the bad reputation that the Victorians had. Of course, most of this has been lost. This is the frustrating thing about jokes. They sit in that sort of liminal space between oral culture and textual culture. Occasionally they drift into text and they get captured and sort of frozen in time, but generally they exist in a slightly more fluid way. They get retold, they get adapted, passed on, changed, and occasionally those things are captured in print. And quite often they're captured by accident. A lot of the jokes that have survived have not survived because somebody in the 19th century thought, this is such a great joke, we must preserve it for eternity. They're there in the margins, like stowaways, in more important texts, as column fillers in newspapers, on the back page of a newspaper that was preserved for its political news. And so, I suppose what I'm interested in, what I really want to do in my work, is to try and recapture these jokes. This is the kind of position which I started from this project. It's this big question, how can I find these, how can I work with them, and how could other historians do the same? I don't just want to sort of find my own little private collection of these things. I want, maybe nobody else wants to do this, but I want the world to start looking at these jokes and seeing what they can do with them. So before we sort of maybe think about how we might do that from a technical point of view, I think it's worth just mentioning why it's worth doing, and again just to kind of capture the centrality of joking to the 19th century before we talk about some more digital things. I don't have time to do this as there's a whole book in this that I don't have time to go through really, but certainly just a few nice little examples I think to capture this. This is a book called The Punster's Pocketbook, or The Art of Punning, which was written by a journalist called Charles Malloy Westoncourt, who was the editor of The Age, one of the great Sunday newspapers, writing at this point under the pseudonym Bernard Blackmantle, from 1826, actually pre-Victorian. What I really like about this is it's a celebration of punning, the most Victorian kind of humour, really lame, tortured wordplay. And what this book does, it just celebrates it as a great aspect of Victorian society. The book is filled with, I don't know if they're real or maybe invented examples of famous people cracking jokes. So here we have, the Duke of Wellington in action, as it were, but he's not, it's not on the battlefield, he's making a quip. Or the Duchess of Devonshire, and there are hundreds of pages of these things, whether they were real or not. There's a really nice section in one of the other chapters where it talks about a fellow of infinite jest. What I really like about this is it captures, I think, the value that was placed on joking as an aspect of Victorian culture and sociability. So in this quote we can see, there are very few literary persons in London, at least among those connected with the public press, who have not occasionally enjoyed the pleasant punning conversational powers of my friend W.R.V., whose whim, wit and great good nature are not more esteemed than his unaffected manners and sincerity of disposition justly entitled to. Kind of long-winded compliment, but it captures that importance of jokes as part of kind of the social, I suppose the sociability or the sort of Victorian literary circles. In fact, if we go back to one of those pages from before, you can kind of see the way in which these jokes were meant to be enjoyed. Around the dinner table, here we have literally a punch bowl filled with Mr. Punch as well. And in fact, this idea, it sort of reminds us, as I said before, that jokes are not things that were to be enjoyed in silence or to be read necessarily in a book, but to be told, to be shared with people. In fact, we've got some more examples of this here. This is from, this is fast forwarding 50 years to the Railway Book of Fun, which, as you can see from its front page, was designed to be bought at a railway station, shared with your friends, maybe inflicted on your fellow passengers, depending on whether they wanted it or not. And again, what I like about these books always have introductions where they sort of justify why they exist. And in this one, cheerfulness is defined as a Christian duty and an essential part of good health. And if you wanted to be healthy in mind, body and spirit, you should tell jokes. That's what this book is telling you. As I said, what I really like about it as well is it captures this idea that jokes are meant to be portable, to be shared. In fact, I've got another example here. the wallet of wit, which is literally a wallet of wit. It is in my waistcoat pocket. It is small enough to be able to carry around and to crack jokes from whoever might be passing by. So let me flick over, see if I can find one. Oh god, this is not necessarily a funny one. We could be here forever, couldn't we? Oh god, I should have prepared something rather than just flicking through anyway. A lot of it's kind of worse. Okay, here we go. The author who speaks about his own books is almost as bad as a mother who talks about her own children. So, it's not the best news when I talk on my own project for 40 minutes, is it? But what I got this is it literally fits in my waistcoat pocket. You can carry it around with you, a wallet of wit at your disposal, whenever you might need it. And again, we can see more examples of this, about how jokes were meant to be used. This is a review from, it's an extraordinary book. You can get this on the Internet Archive if you want. It's called Punniana, or Thoughts Wise and Otherwise. Was evidently successful enough to inspire a sequel called More Punniana, which is just, it's about 400 pages of terrible, terrible puns. If you just put Punniana into the Internet Archive, you'll be able to find it. But in a review of it for the Morning Post, it kind of captured why this book would be used. And it said, the most fitting place for this book is in the hands of the young gentleman who has undertaken to amuse an assembled party brought together for the purpose of spending a pleasant evening. It's a kind of form of entertainment to use on your friends. And again, if we kind of just want to capture the importance of this, there's another really nice extract I found here. Actually, I didn't find this. This was passed on to me by the press historian Andrew Hobbs, who found it, and because I do stuff on Victorian jokes, and I can't blah blah like this. What I really like about it, it is a joke itself. It is a joke about people who steal jokes, and it's a kind of comic set of regulations for an imagined joke copyright protection company. Which is kind of interesting on Twitter right now. There's a lot of debates about people stealing jokes, ripping each other off, retweeting or taking out people's names. This is a kind of Victorian solution to that problem, where it complains that it has been the custom of certain individuals frequently encountered in society who are desirous of being called droll dogs, smart fellows, capital company, funny creatures, agreeable rattlers, wags, and similar appellations, to maintain their reputations by pilfering the jokes of other people and thus trade on false capital. I love this last phrase, false capital. If jokes are a kind of conversational capital, particularly if you invent your own, it is a sort of resource to be spent on improving your sort of relationships with people. So all of this, the reason I'm sort of stressing all of this, is that I think it kind of captures that far from being humourless, dour, and not at all interested in joking, we see that jokes were important to Victorians, that they did use them, it was an important part of conversation, and just because they didn't necessarily preserve them, just because they're ephemeral, doesn't mean they're not important. I think that's the case of a lot of forms of ephemeral culture. Just because they're thrown away doesn't mean for that one moment they weren't significant. I think jokes in particular are a good example of this, there's tons of others. We treat them like light bulbs, right? They burn brightly for a bit and they're useful for that moment, but once they burn out, we throw them away. We don't think of archiving, we don't think of saving them. And jokes, I think, have fallen victim to that. They've been forgotten, but in the moment, they were important, I think. And that's part of their power, right? They're very much tied to a particular moment, and why historians might find them useful. So, we sort of, hopefully I've set up the fact that the Victorians thought jokes were important, funny, worthwhile. The question actually for historians then is, what are we going to do with them? Or for modern audiences more broadly, what significance do these texts have? And as James sort of alluded to in his intro, it's fair to say they've not necessarily aged well. I'm not saying we're going to sort of uncover millions for millions of the greatest jokes ever written in these archives. And in fact, just to give you an example of this, I've got a page here from Punniana, this incredibly torturous book of puns. And if any of you can see, there are some terrible jokes here. I'm going to highlight just one, just because I think it's one of the worst here, and also one of the most interesting. In its down, sorry, this is the cover of Punniana. Down at this one here. And actually, I'm going to test the people in the room on this and see if they can figure out why it was meant to be funny. Let me read it out for those of you if you can't see it. Why is Lord Overstone like a Britannia metal teapot? Because he's alloyed with lots of tin. Complete silence in the room here. There is no kind of barrels of laughter going on. Is anybody sort of immediately thinking, oh, I get it, but it's not great? Yes, people. Okay. When I sort of tried this on the last audience, people just sort of, I have no idea what this is. If you're still trying to figure it out at home, let me show you some clues. And this is a Britannia metal teapot. This is Lloyd Samuel Jones. This is rather Lord Overstone, and he was a banker. So in other words, his name is Lloyd, he has lots of money, i.e. tin, and which makes him like a Britannia metal teapot, which were made by, alloying tin. It is an incredibly laboured joke, and it only works if you know who this Lord Overstone is, if you know how Britannia metal teapots are made, if you're aware of the slang at the time. For modern audiences, you're not going to see Jimmy Carr go up on stage at the, live at the Apollo and tell this joke. It will not work. But for a historian, because it's embedded with so many of these reference points, things that people at the time were expected to know, to get, like that instantly. I know how teapots are made. I know who this guy is. I know he's rich. I think, it kind of reveals something. It certainly reveals the fact that Lloyd was supposedly famous enough of a cultural reference point to be kind of the go-to guy to talk about somebody who had lots of money. And this is, one joke in amongst, 1,000. You can kind of do interesting things with them. It's worth stressing as well that this is not, we can't read too much into one joke published in an obscure collection. But I did some digital searching. This is one of the great things about digital archives now, is the way they allow us to link content in often rather different places. And I started searching for this joke. I thought, I wonder if anybody else told it. And it turns out they did. So first things first, apparently, and this is only using digital archives, this is a partial picture, of course, as always, we're not going to get everything. But apparently, in March 1859, it was told at one of the dinners that were thrown by the people who worked and contributed to Punch, apparently Thackeray laughed heartily, according to the memoirs of somebody who was there, who remembered the joke as well, and years later jotted it down as something that was told around the dinner table. Pretty soon after, it was reprinted in a whole range of newspapers. The North Wales Chronicle, the Hampshire Advertiser, the Family Herald, the Leeds Times, the Manchester Times, the Cheshire Observer, the Leeds Intelligentsia, Berrow's Worcester Journal, the Westmoreland Gazette, Berkshire Chronicle, the Hereford Times, Belfast Newsletter, all within the space of a month. This joke goes viral in some kind of way. And it kind of keeps going. A few years later, 1863, it appears out of nowhere in the Sherborne Mercury and in a collection of riddles and jokes collected by the editor of Every Boys magazine. In 1867, so we're talking good 7 or 8 years after it's initially told, it appears in that book I showed you in Punniana. So he's actually ripped it off. He hasn't, the editor hasn't actually written this pun himself. And it also appears then again in the Bedfordshire Times and Independent. In 1870, it goes up, surfaces again suddenly out of nowhere. It appears in Judy, which rivals of Punch, the Belfast Newsletter, the Lancaster Gazette, Lloyd's Weekly, the most popular paper of its time, the Cardiff and Merthyr Guardian, a little bit less popular, and Jackson's Oxford Journal. And then in Canada, in the Huron Expositor and the Hamilton Spectator, and finally, 25 years later, after its initial publication, it ends up in Australia. So we have here a joke that is, on the surface, incredibly bad, a torture pun, appearing in all sorts of places. And each time it appears, an editor is making a decision. They're thinking, oh, I like this joke, my readers might like this joke, we're going to publish it. And it tells us certainly that Lord Overstone remains current around the world as a reference point for 20, 30 years. Now, I'm not writing a biography of Lord Overstone, but if I was, this would be interesting to me. This would be the kind of thing where I think, well, this is a kind of interesting case study to see how a man's reputation is constructed and discussed in unexpected ways. So, hopefully what I've tried to do in this kind of introductory bit, this sort of historical section, is to try and think about the ways in which historians might use jokes, why they might be significant. I think it's worth just kind of doing a quick overview here. Humour, more generally, I think is a really great subject for historians, and it's been, plenty of historians and literary critics have explored it. But the dynamics of laughter, the things we laugh at, the people we laugh at, the reasons why we laugh at them, and the power relations that are reinforced or challenged within those jokes are significant, they're interesting, they're things that historians can get a lot of material out of. Certainly, many of these jokes that are reprinted, that are published in the most popular papers in the country, they do give us access to popular attitudes and ideas. If only because sometimes in a joke, these ideas have been subverted. People are coming in with an expectation of how a mother-in-law will act, or how a priest is supposed to act. The joke will either reinforce that or challenge it. And they give us access to those little things, little fragments. Language and culture is always very sort of well represented in these jokes. And you get a lot of slang, you get a lot of dialect, you get a lot of characters speaking, characters who are supposed to capture a certain class or profession, being captured in their language again. Very interesting. And finally, for me, as a sort of historian of media and newspapers, they also really allow us to map media networks of reprinting and of exchange, because they are meant to go viral. They are designed to be clipped, reprinted. They're uniquely good at that. And unlike news, which of course loses its value in a few days, in a week, a lot of these jokes, because they're not entirely topical, kind of drift around for a while, and we can use them to kind of track the way in which ideas and print moves physically. And finally, as I've tried to prove this in some of my other research and indeed in this intro, they do have a historical significance, a significance to the people at the time. And if nothing else, that should mean that historians find something to do with them. So, that's why we should study Victorian jokes, at least why I think it's worth doing. The next question then is, how are we going to do it? What are the challenges of doing this kind of work? I think it's fair to say, before I carry on, I'm not suggesting here that no historian has ever studied Victorian humour. There's plenty of great work done on various forms of Victorian comedy, Victorian literary humour. Generally, I'm speaking in very general terms here, but the bulk of it has focused on a relatively small literary canon of great sort of literary humourists. So Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat, my favourite books, it's great, it's been studied to death. Dickens, of course, is a great humorist in his own right. The quips of Oscar Wilde, or indeed of Mark Twain. And of course Punch. Punch is the kind of, often the voice of Victorian humour. And yet actually, when you look at a lot of work on Punch, again, I'm speaking in general terms now, there are exceptions to this rule, but A lot of it focuses on the images, on the great sort of woodcuts that would be, make its reputation. You look at Punch, it is filled with one-liners and little jokes. They always get ignored. People go straight for the cartoons, for the images. That's kind of what made the magazine iconic. Those are the things that now appear in sixth form history textbooks, not the gags that surrounded them. There are some notable exceptions to this. People have exposed, popular humour. Roger Savin's done some great stuff on Ali Slope, the Victorian comic. There is this particularly great book I would draw your attention to called The Victorian Clown by Jackie Bratton and Anne Featherstone that includes the joke books of the Victorian clown, in the back that were discovered. So you actually see, his personal joke books and the kind of jokes he used as part of his act. This is a great example of when that really, the oral culture of jokes has been captured very fortunately for us. I recommend that heartily. It's a terrific book. But there was a lot of media attention that surrounded this book when it was launched, and deservedly so. But the sort of excitement was that, my God, we found a few hundred Victorian jokes as if they were these treasured things. You go into the British Library or into its digital archives, there are millions of them, absolutely millions. So this is just very much the tip of the iceberg. So the question then, that I want to really tackle for the rest of this presentation, is if Victorian jokes exist in great numbers, and there are millions of them, if they're fairly easy to find, you can't open a popular newspaper at the time without running into them, why haven't historians looked at them? Why have we neglected them? And I think partly, as I said, it's to do with reputation, but there is another reason, and it's to do with these things, with archives, with the structure of archives and how we organise material. And I'm not saying anything new here. There's been a lot of terrific work done on a theorisation of archives, but I think just at a general level, it's worth sort of reminding ourselves that archives play an enormous role in mediating our relationship with the past. They give shape to the past in interesting ways. They draw boundaries between certain areas, between certain collections, based on things that are included, things that are excluded. And their design, whether it's physical archives like this or digital archives, shapes the way we move around them, the way we access information, the way we miss other forms of information. And the structure of archives, I think, encourages us to access the past in particular ways. In the case of a library like this, it'll be browsing perhaps by the name of the author or the title of a book, by the genre of a book if we're lucky. There will certainly be no way of browsing this archive that says, right, show me all the jokes. They're not built into the structure of the archive. They were never designed in that way. And I suppose what I'm interested in at the moment is thinking, well, these structures are great. They exist for a reason. They were one good way of making sense of an enormous amount of information and of providing those pathways to help people find content. But do we have to stick with these structures? Are there ways we could turn these structures on their head and find new ways of thinking about archives, of organising them, that allow us to do new things, to access forms of culture that were marginal or ephemeral, captured by accident in the margins of other texts? It's worth remembering, even though digital archives have done a lot to destabilise these old structures, they still have their own structures, their own ways of their metadata, their own ways of encouraging us to access them and explore them. And while that's great in some cases, in other points I think it poses some problems, and that's kind of what I want to talk about now. So let's go back to this terrible joke about Lord Ferguson that we deconstructed earlier. Now imagine that we wanted to find this joke. If we were going to sort of try and find some examples, as I did, what we might do. Now, under a conventional archive, so before digitisation of this thing, you would have to access this in what might be termed a sort of top-down model, where generally if you're looking for content in a newspaper, you select a type and you think, oh, right, okay, I'm going to look in the Times, or I'm going to look in Lloyd's Weekly. That's the sort of first point we take, and then we'd go to Colindale or wherever and we would order it. Then we'd have to think, okay, what issue number are we going to go for? Now, if we were looking for a particular event, if we're looking at the sinking of the Titanic, we know there was a particular date on which we're likely to find newspaper coverage. A joke like that, not a clue where we would start. Then, within an issue, we would kind of think, okay, let's try and find the headers. We're not going to read an entire issue of the Times. I did a word count on an issue of the Times from the 1840s the other day. 200,000 words in a single issue of the Times. So 2 to 3 PhD theses published every day at the office of the Times. We're not going to read through that every time we want to find a single joke. And eventually, after all of that process of kind of working our way down, we eventually end up in an article. An article that we hope is going to be the right one. Chances are it won't be. We move on to the next one. And this sort of top-down process eventually leads us to a single article. Now, what digitisation, of course, has done, as we all know, is turn this structure on its head, and now keyword searching allows us to access article text directly. We no longer have to browse through these structures. We can just search everything at once, which is great. So certainly, the search I did to find this joke and track it around the world was, you can't put the full joke in because one tiny OCR error will mean you miss it. So I just searched for the phrase, why is Lord Overstone? It turns out that wasn't a very well-used phrase, apart from in this joke. And eventually I was able to find, dotted around various archives, examples of this joke. Fine. And digital archives allowed me to do this. Imagine if I was doing it the other way. I would have to travel to archives all around the world, Canada, Australia, America, the British Library, leaf through every periodical thinking, is there a joke about Lord Overson in here? It would be a life's work for absolutely no good reason. Digital archives have transformed that. But imagine we didn't have this joke. Let's say that we didn't have this starting point as I did by finding it and putting on it. What if instead we just wanted to find jokes about bankers? It's interesting now, people are cracking a lot of jokes about bankers in the wake of the crisis. I think there's quite an interesting article to be written, and perhaps not by me, but by somebody else. I don't have time for this one, but about the history of joking about bankers and how that sort of works. Where would we start? Well, if we didn't have the keywords, the joke text itself, suddenly things become very, very difficult. If we're going to search for phrases like banking, banker, money, those kind of general terms in the British newspaper archive, well, we kind of know what's going to happen, right? You're going to get masses upon masses of results. You're just going to see them in financial columns, in news columns, in serialised fiction, the lot. There's going to be far too much. Within that, there will be some jokes scattered around in amongst millions, thousands of other texts. It's a problem. We can maybe improve our search a bit by searching for articles with the titles which have words like jokes, wit, humour, jest. This is where I do my own research. And that works up to a point. It cuts out a lot of the sort of the noise. But inevitably, you also lose a lot of other stuff because not all jokes are published in columns with these titles. So you have this constant, the point I'm trying to make here is you're constantly fighting against the weight of an archive when you're doing this kind of searching. So much of your searching of your keywords is to do with excluding content but not trying to exclude too much. It's a really difficult balance, and I think it poses some problems when we're dealing with these enormous collections. And it's worth I think at this point, just reminding ourselves, particularly newspapers, that are extraordinarily varied texts. Martin Convoy, the press historian, uses the term heteroglossia, or multiple voices, to describe newspapers and the way they're written. And I think he's absolutely right. These are 2 pages from the Hampshire Telegraph and Sussex Chronicle from 1890. Page 11 and 12, so towards the back of the paper. Just look at the different content that is in here. We have jokes, first things first, and interestingly, multiple joke columns scattered around. They're not ordered into one simple part of the paper. We also have poetry scattered around, fiction over here, some gossip over here, a children's column here, letters here, and interestingly these overlap, right? So within the children's column there are poetry and letters, so these things require multiple ways of categorization. There are recipes over here, there are book reviews down there, and the rest of it I can't even categorize. It's kind of miscellany human interest. We have a guide to kissing for beginners over here, we have stories about honeymoons over here, days of grog, these are tales from retired sailors, extraordinary range of stuff. All archives are like this. Newspapers just kind of heighten it by putting it all on the same page. And it's worth sort of remembering that each of these texts is produced in different ways, written by different people, coming from different kind of literary traditions or working practices. They are different texts, and after they are gathered in this moment on this one day, a lot of them have a second life. They get clipped out, they get exchanged, some get discarded. Some of them have a life before they arrived here. They're gathered here in this one moment, but they are independent things, newspaper articles. Well, united in the newspaper, but independent in their own kind of way. And if we were building digital archives for each of these pieces of content, as we might well do, an archive of newspaper poetry, an archive of recipe columns, an archive of serialised fiction, would be great. We would have completely different metadata for all of them. They would not be organised using the same categories, which is what we do now. They've been built into a newspaper, into an archive, which has tried to think of a way of organising all of this content and all its disparate and eclectic forms with the same metadata categories. And that's problematic. So imagine we've got a joke here, it's not a particularly good one. It's titled A Useful Present. Mrs. Henry Peck, whose mother has been visiting them for over 4 months, says, "I don't know what to buy mother for a Christmas present, do you?" To which her husband replies, "Yes, buy her a travelling bag." So, good Victorian mother-in-law joke. Interestingly, this doesn't include the word mother-in-law. So if you're actually searching for it using a keyword search, you would not find it. You would have to search for mother, and immediately think about all the other things you would find it. But what if we had metadata for it? Think about all the different categories we could have. Some of them would be about the source type, the source location. But then you might think about things like the title of the joke, the publication to which it was attributed, its author if we knew, the format of the joke. Wouldn't it be nice if we could sort of search for puns or conversations or comic definitions and separate them out? We might talk about the nationality where it's published. This was an American joke. And we might also start thinking about characters and their qualities. What if we had metadata for each character? This is the metadata that exists within the archive. Everything else is something that we would have to add. But yeah, what if we had ones for characters? So what if we had for Mrs. Henry Peck? We could know that her gender was female, that she was identified in this text as both a wife and a daughter, that she's an adult. If we know the jokes, we had other things about maybe their class, the emotion they're expressing, their appearance. The same for her husband. that would suddenly allow us to explore this archive in some really interesting new ways. We could just search for all the mother-in-law jokes that feature, I don't know, middle-class women or working-class women, if we had that information. I think a good example of this, this is not new, this idea of adding metadata to things to make them more discoverable is nothing new, right? A great example of this is the database of the mid-Victorian illustration, which is one of my favourite archives just to idly browse through. And as you can kind of see down the left here, it has an extraordinary range of metadata. You can search for, in this case I've gone for people relationships, family relationships, in-laws. So this is a way of browsing to images about your in-laws. But you can also sort of filter this and say, well, show me images that are outside and that feature a working class man sitting on a stool or something like that. It's extraordinary levels of data on there. In fact, there's one of these, going back to the sort of the comic format I showed you before, that works well for that joke we had. I don't know what to buy a mother for a Christmas present, do you? When the desperate man replies, yes, buy her a travelling bag, clearly exhausted by his mother-in-law staying for far too long. But we found that the great thing about this is that images, as you all know, are incredibly difficult to find using search engines because they're not text-based. And metadata, is useful because it describes sources which cannot describe themselves or which cannot describe them using our sort of conventional processing software. And even though jokes are textual, we could apply very much a similar process of annotating them, of adding additional metadata to make them more discoverable and to improve the ways we could interrogate those data sets with a close or distant reading. So, going back to that newspaper page, imagine then instead of dealing with the entire archive in all these sort of forms and constantly having to battle with the weight of it, imagine instead if we could simply look at the jokes. And not just the jokes from one archive, from one newspaper, but all of them, from wherever they might be. There we go. Hey. So this is what I sort of starting to do. Now, before I sort of carry on, there's an important sort of side point I want to make here because it's something that occasionally comes up in questions and I kind of want to address. A historian sort of saying strip text from its context and don't care about the things that it was published around. I'm aware that that could be slightly sort of a controversial thing to say. Particularly as a press historian, I'm constantly moaning about historians cherry-picking from newspapers and not caring about what's around them. And I'm sort of aware that that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm saying let's strip jokes from their books, the newspapers in which they're originally published, and look at them in isolation. I think we need to do that in order to be able to analyse them, to sort of remove them from the noise. But any archive that I would create with this would have a very clear way of linking these jokes back to where they were originally published. And ideally, if all archives were open access and not behind paywalls, it would be simply a button that says, show me where this was originally published. It's a bit more complicated than that, as you know. So I think there was a real sort of balance here of making sure you keep the context, but also not allowing that additional context, all that additional material to weigh you down to impede your analysis. And as historians, it's something we have to be careful about, but I think we shouldn't be too nervous about doing it either. So, this is what I'm thinking about then. My goal at the end of all this is to have a really high quality annotated research archive of 1 million Victorian jokes, let's say, and that's the high end, so I'd be happy with 100,000, but I'm aiming high. So that's what I'm aiming at doing, and that's the position that I sort of was at when I went to the British Library. I wanted to find a way of creating a data set, an archive that I could use, that would be free for other people to use, to interrogate using whatever digital or standard sort of research means that we wish to use. So the question is, how do we do it? How do we take stuff that has already been digitised, that exists in archives, and remix it, create new archives from existing content? And I don't really have an answer for this. I've sort of been thinking about this for a while. This project is still very much ongoing. The British Library part of it, I should say, finished sort of earlier this year. Edgehill, my university, funded the further development of the project, so we're working on it now. But it's a kind of slow burn at the moment. So I'm certainly not coming today and saying, look at how we've solved all these incredible challenges that everybody faces with digital archives. I'm just kind of setting up some of the things that I've been thinking about, and actually I'm kind of throwing the ideas out here and saying, can you fix these problems? Do you know the solutions here? So let's think about some of these challenges. The first one, actually, the challenge we would normally get with creating a digital archive is that we have to scan stuff. We have to, find books like this and find ways of photographing them, scanning them, preserving them. The great thing about remixing is you don't have to do that unless you want to. They've already been digitised. This is a new way of creating an archive. It's not starting from the ground up by going into a shelf and grabbing loads of books. It is saying, right, we've spent time, we've spent money, enormous amounts of money in some cases, digitising things. Let's start to reuse them. Let's think about new ways we can use that content. So actually, I may well digitise some of my own joke books from my collection, but by and large I'm interested in using ones that have already been created and are held currently by the British Library. So the actual challenge then is not digitising things from scratch, it's figuring out how do we get them out of existing archives. And this is tricky. And the first barrier, of course, as you've all figured out by now, is actually getting access to this data and getting the right to do what we want with it, to actually remix. So it's the same things that obviously anybody else doing any kind of remixing, DJs, artists have the same problem. Do they have permission to reuse this content? And this is tricky, and it's worth sort of stressing that, of course, the way in which we might get access to these things is going to differ for every archive. So I'm talking here about using multiple collections of newspapers, magazines, books. Every single one of them is going to pose a different kind of problem here. And I mean, I should say that I've been quite fortunate that that Gale and DC Thompson have given me permission to use their content from the newspaper archives. So in a sense, that hurdle isn't there. But I just want to say, that this is, I imagine, a theme that comes up a lot in discussions around digital history. I don't want to sort of turn this into a moaning rant about copyright, but this is one of those moments where increasingly I start to realise the problems this poses and the barriers it poses for our research. Because it used to be, before I started thinking about these kind of projects, that I felt that my work was limited by what we might say, by what was possible, by the things that I could find, by the methodologies I could use. Increasingly it feels like my research is limited by what's permissible, particularly by digitisation companies deciding whether I can access the data, whether I can republish it, whether I can use it in other ways. And even when they say yes, and I should say that every time I've worked with professional commercial publishers, they've been enthusiastic, supportive, great, wonderful, and I can't fault the way that they've worked with me. But still, the fact that we had to get that permission, I think, poses some quite important philosophical problems for our research. If we're having to limit the way we do things by what is permissible rather than what is possible, I think we run the risk of maybe missing out on some really interesting work. And so this is sort of an issue that I'm sort of rubbing up against at the moment, and I think we all are working in the digital humanities, and it's not necessarily something I've got a solution for, but certainly, the kind of the work that's been done on open access academic publishing now, I really hope we're going to see that movement extended to archives in as much as we possibly can. But yeah, that's a discussion for another time. Data format is another thing. Technically, from a sort of practical point of view, every single digital archive that I've tried to work with is organised in a different way. They use different sort of ways of formatting their XML, different sort of structures in which their data is stored. Sometimes even getting access to it in a format that is usable is very, very difficult. So again, there are challenges here, and particularly this is going to be the case for any remixing project. You're going to have to work with different data sets and make them talk to each other, which is problematic. So the question is, okay, if we're going to sort of extract things from existing archives, are we going to find a way to do this automatically, to be able to sort of develop some kind of script that pulls things out for us, or do we have to manually go in and say, yep, I'll have that, and pull it out? And this is sort of the thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently. When I initially pitched this project to the British Library, I naively thought that I could just go to them and say, give me everything that has the title jokes in the title column, and they would just kind of type on a computer and it would just be pulled out. And that potentially could still happen, though we had troubles at the time getting full access to the data set. If we look at 19th century British newspapers, which is the kind of main data set I'm working with at the moment, you can kind of see that actually it does have a specific title field. It breaks newspapers down into individual articles, they have titles, and what that means is that actually, because a lot of jokes were published in dedicated columns, if we find the title of that column, we should be able to identify and isolate them fairly well. And this is a sort of look at the XML for, this is the Daily Mail archive actually, but you can see there is a title field there. So it should be possible to index this and to pull things out. And when I get access to this data set in the way I need it, that's hopefully what we're going to do. But then there are problems, because Victorian newspaper editors were a great fan of novelty, and just describing their joke columns as jokes was evidently not enough for them, and certainly in this case the Hampshire Telegraph, one of my favourite papers, decided every week to change the name of its joke column, which from a point of view of sort of extracting it, is a bloody pain. So this is its column of imported American jokes. It goes from being called, well, Book Week Cakes. I mean, if you saw that issue, you think it's a recipe column, right? But you go in and you find it's browned on these are browned on a Yankee griddle, hot from Yankee fires. There are different ones every time. And so at that point, you start to think, well, we're going to have to do some kind of manual searching here, possibly. The sort of fable solution to this that I really want us to try and find, but maybe beyond us, is to try and build some kind of software that recognises jokes from in amongst other texts and sort of things. Well, that looks like a joke, we can probably pull it out. This is kind of sort of blue sky thing. We don't have a way to do this yet. But if you look at this joke here, which is, there's a lot of these jokes, oh no, this is a different one, okay. An unpremeditated denouement, Bob Bunkum, an actor, failure, I should think it was, why the whole play was ruined. The hostess says, how was that? He replies, well, at the end of the last set, a steam pipe burst and hissed me off the stage. Not a particularly good joke, but I picked this one because it shows you the structure that these jokes often use. You have a title in capital letters, which is indented there. Then you have characters, with names which are often capitalised, followed by a description in brackets and a colon. There are common structures here and an attribution at the end. It might be possible to sort of train, once we've re-OCR'd joke columns, or indeed OCR'd an entire newspaper data set, to look for these common features and try and pick them out. We're sort of working on that. It's still a long way down the line. I don't want to sort of promise that we're going to find a way, like a magic joke detection tool, But I think it's one of the kind of bigger problems that actually a lot of us would be interested in solving. How do you extract certain forms of text from a wider archive? And if anybody's got any sort of bright ideas on how to do that, wants to have a go at it, let me know. So, I think the automatic route is great. It would be nice. It would allow us to sort of do this at a much greater rate. For now, at the moment, I'm literally just going in, right-clicking, downloading joke columns and processing them myself, which is not going to. I'm not going to get to 1 million jokes that way. Otherwise, I will go mad. But we'll get to a few thousand in it. So let's say you've got them. Let's say you pull these jokes out of existing collections. Then the next challenge is actually how do you integrate them into a new collection? How do you convert things that are in different file formats, different sort of structures, into a new structure based around, in this case, jokes, but it could be anything. So again, data format's an issue. For us, one of the biggest problems actually is image segmentation, is actually taking a joke column or a joke book and breaking it down into individual jokes and trying to do that automatically. At the moment, again, I'm doing this manually just by slicing them up in Photoshop, but again, that is not a sustainable way to build a massive archive. You can see this is a classic joke column, and again, if we kind of separate these out, but you can see there are individual jokes in there. And again, I think it's possible using these indentations and some of the text formatting to train something that will actually recognise the format of these. But of course, this is just one joke column in one newspaper. Might we have to train for every type of newspaper? That's where it becomes very, very tricky. Creating sort of solutions for very, very small problems that need to be replicated in different ways is very tricky. So we need to sort of figure out where to do that. Initially, when we first started doing this with the British Library, we had users transcribe the entire column and divide it themselves, which might be what we have to do. But the sort of response we got from that was that people found transcribing an entire column of 30 or 40 jokes, maybe take 20 minutes, half an hour. They found that a little bit laborious, and they would prefer just to do one joke at a time. So if we're trying to motivate people to do this work, as I'll talk about in a minute, then we need to sort of deal with them individually. So finally, this is sort of getting on to the slightly more, the stuff that I'm working on at the moment. I should say that those two bits of the project are sort of on hold at the moment, and this is the bit that we've got funding for from Edgehill at the moment, which is about annotating jokes and processing them. I'm sort of maybe naively saying, we'll figure out a way to get them somehow, and we kind of, I think we will. So, once we've done that, how do we make these jokes readable? How do we improve them? The first and obvious step will be to OCR them. And it's worth sort of reminding, I think as many of you will know, that the OCR is not all OCR programs are created equally. And these are some samples that we did using free apps or our university's own scanners, and then there's a more professional Abbey Fine Reader over here. These are completely unusable. Clearly, we can never sort of make sense of that. Abbey's pretty good. This is using a fairly good clean text. It's been expanded a little bit there, but this is about as good as it gets in terms of the quality of the text for us. And you can see here that with Abbey, it's done all right. It's got some little mistakes. The kind of the little leftovers were from the segmentation thing that caused problems down here. Here we have an exclamation point mistaken for an L. So there's a few little things there. But by and large, it's usable. So we'll definitely do it. We'll certainly make these texts searchable using OCR. But for the kind of things we want to do, which is sort of remixing them, republishing them in interesting ways, we need as far as possible to get to a point where the transcriptions are perfect or near enough. This is a good example actually of how Abbey falls down. One of the really frustrating things about joke columns is they are often the last column on a page, which means that you get these little bits here where they're bent. And here you can see it's got all sorts of slightly confusing characters being added to it. So OCR is useful, and in newspapers, of course, we accept these errors because we're dealing with an enormous amount of text that could never be processed, or probably won't be processed in other ways. I know there are some newspaper collections that are doing extraordinary work with crowdsourcing. But by and large, we accept this and we say, okay, it's enough for us to do basic searching. What we need to do, we need something a bit more. So what we did with the British Library was actually just get users to transcribe our columns from scratch. Interestingly, we found that they found it quicker to transcribe from scratch than correcting text. And actually they enjoyed it a bit more as well. We're still kind of experimenting now because we only had a few people doing it. But Ben O'Steen at the British Library Labs put together this nice sort of quick system using Omeka and Scripto to kind of just get us off the ground. And we're now building our own bespoke transcription platform at Edgehill for the project. So once we've done that, of course, what we then want to figure out how to do is to add all this extra information. Once we've transcribed the joke, we've got its basic text. We want all these additional information about characters, about subjects. That this is a mother-in-law joke about Christmas. And there are some ways to do this automatically, to process these texts and to look for particular words, particular structures that might be able to do this automatically. But jokes are complicated, right? How do we train a computer to recognise a pun, to kind of pick up on those incredibly nuanced bits of language? It might be possible to do bits of this automatically, but what became very clear early on is that jokes and a lot of other texts are so complicated, so nuanced, they need the human eye to look at them and to add this information themselves. So the big question, the thing that we're working on right now, is how do you do this? How do you actually motivate people to add this information? How do we collect it? And how do we collect it not just for 10 jokes or 20 jokes, but for potentially thousands of them? The answer, of course, and how do we do it for free, or at least for very, very little money, without sort of sending this off to sort of a transcription company in India, as they do for some of the newspaper archives? And the answer to this, I think, as the answer to a lot of digital projects at the moment, seems to be crowdsourcing, which I think is is now being used for all sorts of projects. These are just a few of the ones that kind of I encountered in my own research, but there are tons of other examples. With the Dickens Journals Online project, transcribed pretty much all of the periodicals that Dickens published, Household Words and all those things, and all year round. They were transcribed by users. That's now fully functional archive. Transcribe Bentham at UCL is another great example of this kind of work. There is, of course, these sort of slightly more flashy projects that the Zooniverse is involved within citizen science, and then Project Gutenberg as well, which was largely a transcription of it. There are tons of others, and I'm an enormous fan of this kind of work. The big dilemma for anybody running these projects is how do you actually motivate people to do it? How do you gather together volunteers who are going to donate their time to do something for us? And I think the answer is there has got to be something in it for them. And a lot of these other projects have motivated people, quite rightly, by saying you are contributing to a great historical project, you are helping us to create these archives. That's fantastic, and clearly they've had great success doing that. Others have thought a little bit more about more creative ways of gamifying these processes, of creating things like leaderboards, badges that you earn by transcribing. I think there's some evidence that works. I'm a little sceptical about those kind of rewards and how effective they are really motivating people. It might work for some people though. And so this is what we've been thinking about on our project. How might we motivate people to sit down and look at Victorian jokes and actually add all this extra information that we need? And the idea that we're sort of working with is a form of this gamification, but it's I suppose rather than just drawing upon things like leaderboards, scores, badges, all that kind of stuff, we sort of wanted to sort of encourage users to do something a little bit more creative, let's say, and to do something that might be termed, or I think has been termed by Nicholson, I think, meaningful gamification, forms of gamification that encourage people to engage in processes that they find valuable, not just because they get a little reward at the end of it. And this is a mock-up that I'm showing behind me of an interface that we're developing. It probably will look nothing like this. This was just something I created on Photoshop. And the core idea here, this is where I'm working with a colleague, Chillan, at the moment, is to capture all these annotations during the transcription process, but to do it in a way that users feel is engaging their creativity. So at the moment what will happen is that they will transcribe a joke will appear up here, they'll transcribe it, and then they will add information, let's say, about characters or locations, and as they're doing it, a cartoon version of the joke will be constructed in front of them. So their decisions, the data they give us, is sort of reflected in the creation of this image here. And at the end of it, they can tweet it, they can send it out on Twitter, they can share it with their friends. It is a kind of little bit of that social capital that I talked about earlier, of people sort of being given something that they can, a joke that they can tell. And ideally, what we should get to a point where this doesn't seem like a really laborious transcription interface, but where the process of creating a joke or being creative essentially captures the data we need. This is what we're kind of looking for. And I like to call this a form of reciprocal impact. Impact is this word that historians in the UK will be very, very aware of at the moment, where we've been really encouraged to demonstrate the impact of our research to external groups outside of the academy, the media, the public, libraries. And initially when I thought this project, it was very much a one-way kind of conversation. I wanted to convert my jokes into a format that could be shared with other people, and then to sort of send it out into the world and see if they liked it. What this does is a slightly more reciprocal conversation. We allow people to get engaged in the process. They get these images that can be shared on Twitter or on Tumblr or whatever. But in the process, they improve our archive as well. So it's not just saying, we've built something, what are you going to do with it? It's saying, help us build something, get something out of it yourself, be creative. And hopefully at the end of it, they'll have something that they like, that they want to share. And we'll also have an improved archive. So it is, even though these things are quite sort of frivolous and daft, the idea is that by creating them, we end up with a much more rich research platform for us to use. This is still being built. We're still kind of working on how this is all going to function. But hopefully, sometime sort of spring next year, we'll be having sort of versions of this we can start to show people, and people can try it for themselves. So, what I've sort of tried to talk about today in this talk has been two forms of remixing. Then. So, first things first, challenging the structures of existing archives, which prioritise certain forms of text, of culture, of objects over others, and instead thinking about how can we remix that, how can we restructure archives in order to make ephemeral texts or marginalised texts a little bit more accessible, and to perhaps create research environments that are designed for a very specific kind of object. I've also talked a little bit about the kind of creative remixing we want to sort of embed in the creation of this archive. I think finally what I want to finish with is actually just to stress that this kind of creativity is not something that needs to be restricted to our platform, the thing we built. I'm really a great believer in just releasing content and letting people do what they want with it, whether it's artistic work, research work, whether it's creating their own archives, remixing the remixed archive. And as an example of that, what we did as part of this project was send a collection of our jokes to an artist, a filmmaker, animator named Rob Walker, who does a great series called the Victorian Cutout Theatre. You can find him You can find him on Twitter at Timid Weewolf, and he's great. I sent him jokes and just said, do what you want with them, find a way to make them funny. And what he created is this extraordinary animation called My Mother-in-Law, which is kind of a, I'm trying to think how to describe it. It's like a sort of Victorian version of a 1970s sitcom imagined by Monty Python, which I think is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. I'm going to play it now. Those of you watching at home, I think on the slide there should be a link to this that you can put on YouTube if you want to see it. I encourage you to check it out. I'm going to play it here for the rest of us.
Studio audience. That dog of Eliza's across the way bit Mother again this morning, and I want to know what you propose doing about it.
I think I shall buy the dog.
Edwin, dear, Mama's going. Do say something pleasantly. Edwin, my darling, you know I say goodbye to your mother most pleasantly.
The last time you said goodbye pleasantly to my mother was at her funeral.
Nevertheless,
I shall endeavour to do my best.
this is the last night we shall all be together. Tomorrow I shall be far from here, 60 miles away, isn't it, Abigail?
Oh, 60 miles is quite near enough.
Terribly sorry about the dog bite, Mama. Edwin said he would reprimand Eliza for her negligence. Well, I can't judge her and her mongrel too harshly. She hasn't a husband and must have a brute of some sort to look after.
You insult me in my own home.
Now, Edwin, that's quite impossible.
How's that?
You live in a rented house. Abigail, before I depart, I must give you this bit of advice. Yes, Mama? Never love a man for money. It's wrong. But never love a man without money. That's just stupid. Good day.
I think he did a pretty good job with that. I mean, given the material he was working with, I think that's a pretty good effort at trying to make things funny. What I really like about that is that it just kind of shows that these jokes don't have to be studied in an academic context and saved in the way that we want to use them. I think if we love the things we research, I think there's also something to be said for just letting them out there and letting people reuse them. Victorian jokes at the time, they moved virally, as we saw, they moved around the world. There's no reason why we shouldn't allow them to sort of do that again now and encourage them to be rewritten, reused, reappropriated, as they were indeed in the 19th century. Now, I like the idea of creating platforms that encourage that creativity. So certainly as part of the Jokes project, I think we will be encouraging people to create their own versions of jokes, whether it's as comics, whether it's as stand-up sets. I'm desperate to give these to a stand-up comedian and see what can you create a set around these jokes, can you make them funny again? You find somebody brave enough, so if anybody's watching and fancies having a go at that, get in touch. So we'll find ways of of encouraging that and tracking it. I think it's a sort of interesting way of bringing a neglected form of Victorian culture back to life. We're continually reinventing Shakespeare and Dickens and redoing them, setting them in new kind of ways. Why not do it with jokes as well? Okay, that's pretty much it for me. I mean, I should say that if you found this interesting or you want to sort of read more about it, I've got a sort of text version of pretty much of this talk coming out in the journal 19, Interdisciplinary Studies in the Long 19th Century. That should be coming out pretty soon, I think. So I'll tweet links to that as well. So by all means, take a look at that if you want, if you can stomach these jokes again. If not, you can keep up to date with the project and with what I'm doing on my Twitter feed, which is @digivictorian or at digitalvictorianist.com. Thank you very much.